My name is Omar. I'm about to give you a demo of Polimesh.AI within the context of a rental lease agreement. So to get started, the first thing that we're going to do is add a clause that says that a landlord can only enter the premise of a tenant as long as he gives the tenant a 24-hour notice period. And as you can see, the system breaks down this requirement into its store components. To get started with, we can see that things that were detected were two permissions saying that the landlord can enter for repairs. The landlord can also enter for inspections, and the requirement is that the landlord must give a 24-hour notice period. Notice how the system can normalize requirements, such as the notice period being an exact 24 hours. Up next, we can see a bunch of entities that were detected in our clause requirements, one of them being a landlord. Users are expected to create canonical entities, basically data maps that specify the different entities that they're looking for in the system. In this case, the landlord is a role, and it's simply just the owner of a unit. All these descriptions, and this is another one for tenants, all these descriptions are basically used to guide our AI agents in detecting the entities later on in the user's documents. Moving forward, you can see now our policy entity registry has two entities created, the landlord and the tenant. These entities exist across the entire policy and can be reused in the future. So when we add another clause saying that a landlord is only allowed to increase rent by a max of 1 to 2%, once we analyze it and break it down, we should be able to map the landlord back to the same landlord that we created in our canonical entity list. Up next, we upload our document. In this case, this is my personal lease agreement. And now we run the full compliance check. So you can see that the system broke down the document into about 120 chunks. Once the compliance check is running, our AI agents basically go over all of these chunks in parallel and try to detect relevant entities and the requirements associated with them. On the right-hand side, you can see the activity view for all of our agents and what they're doing, what they're detecting, and the things we're finding. Once the report is ready, the user can go onto the compliance report section, and in this section, you'll see an executive summary with a rough overview of your document in general. You'll see that 104 of the chunks have been compliant, but 18 of them have violating chunks, and a rough compliance score. Starting off with the first chunk, well, we'll notice that this chunk is not necessarily applicable. You can see the AI agent went through it and determined that based on the content of this chunk, the text doesn't really apply to the clauses found there. In the third chunk, we'll see partial compliance. And as we'll see in more details here, the reason behind the partial compliance is that the landlord, the document says that the landlord has the right to increase rent as allowed by law. However, this does not specify if there's a maximum increase of 2%, 1%, whatever it is. Therefore, this is a violation, and in order for it to not be a violation, there has to be an amendment that says that there's a maximum of 2% that can be increased on an annual basis. Moving forward, in chunk 72, for example, we'll notice a compliant chunk because, as mentioned, landlord has the permission to come into the unit for repairs and inspections, and the document implicitly says that the tenant agrees to allow owners to enter the premise to inspect, as seen over here. Lastly, for our non-compliant chunks, we'll notice in chunk 98, this is a clear violation because the lease agreement itself says that it explicitly states that action can be taken without prior notice, and this is related for the removal of items or hazardous items from the apartment without telling the tenant in advance. And this is a clear violation of our 24-hour notice period that was stated in the original clause of our policy. So yeah, that's a big overview of Polimesh.AI. There's a separate view which is compliance by clause. We can see compliance checks for clauses instead of per chunk, and we can see the overall compliance of the clause itself.